So I'm guessing we all still feel very fortunate that we live here in Ashland, Oregon, even this week with all the smoke we're contending with. Ashland is a powerful nexus of creativity, community, spirituality, and healing. And so I can't think of a more perfect location to undertake this collective journey. We're gathered together to do something a bit unusual. We're setting out to talk to dead people. Not just anyone who's passed over, rather we're consciously seeking out the dead with whom we're personally connected by DNA, history, and yes, by trauma. Unless you descend from people native to this continent, as Americans, everyone in this room is a descendant of immigrants. People who had to navigate an ocean or cross a border to get here. Whatever made them leave their homelands, that took a lot of courage and a strong sense of the future. So as we begin tonight, I suggest we put aside our usual American devotion to self-sufficiency and individuality and see yourself as the recipient of a gift from whoever it was that replanted the seed of your lineage on this American soil. And now I strongly suggest that you invite this ancestor to be present with you for tonight's talk, not as a fly on the wall, but as an ally, as your ally. Of course, you have the option of skipping this part, but if you want to give it a go, I ask you to do so with a clear and conscious intention to bring in just one ancestor who genuinely feels like your ally. Even better, if you happen to know or suspect that the two of you have both suffered from the same multigenerational trauma, meaning a specific illness, a self-destructive behavior pattern, or a difficult life experience that shows up more than once in your lineage, such as the loss of a child. And as you welcome this spirit to this gathering, open your heart and mind to this ancestor's long-held thoughts and prayers for you and your kin. Also be aware that once invited, this ancestor may choose to stick around, show up in your dreams. They even may orchestrate some amazing serendipity in your life. It happens. So my ally in this journey is the woman pictured in the middle of your screen, and that's my grandmother, Victoria Costello, who has done me the honor of conveying the inspiration for this talk, and indeed the two books that I'll be sharing with you tonight that contain parts of her story and mine. Actually, like most Irish women, Ellen tends to speak in a more plain-spoken way, and so her latest message to me would sound more like, hey girl, it's not enough to write books. You have to get out there and share what you've learned. And so here we are. Speaking of powerful places, that's me with my hand on one of the standing stones erected by proto-Druids some 5,000 years ago in West Cork. Despite the day being cold and rainy, that stone was warm to my touch. It was October 2019, so 4 years ago. And I'll just point out now that you'll see me at various ages with various hair colors and styles in the presentation that's about to unfold. But assume that's me on the screen unless I tell you otherwise. And as a placeholder for you, I'll be parading here my worst traits and failings as a mother and as a human being, all previously confessed in my memoir, A Lethal Inheritance. Please feel free to insert your own worst traits as we go forward. In fact, I encourage it. As Joan Didion famously said, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. My take is we also change our stories in order to heal. So let's get started. See if I can do this. All right. So as advertised, this has been a 2-decade-long quest to understand and heal a century of family trauma. You heard a little bit about me. I was a science writer, Actually, I started in news, moved into science, and then I wrote several books, popular science, memoir, and the last one you'll hear about tonight is my novel, Orchid Child, which is over here, actually. Okay, click, right? So this is a story of 4 generations told in 2 books, the memoir on the side and then my novel, Orchid Child. Tonight I will be exploring links I've discovered in the course of researching and writing these books between ancestral trauma, Druidism, quantum science, I should also add there's some neuroscience in the mix, and healing. To be clear, I am neither a scientist or a medical professional, but like many of you, I am a lifelong spiritual seeker and a student of world religions and especially indigenous belief systems. So let's begin at the beginning. My Irish ancestors connect me to more than my skin and eye color. They connect me to a homeland, a history, culture, language, and the pre-Christian belief system of Druidism. They also connect me to generations of trauma. Most of that occurred under 800 years of brutal British colonial oppression that denied the Irish of their language, their religion, the right to own property or represent themselves or vote even. That also included the Great Hunger in the mid-19th century that wiped out 1 million Irish people and sent another million to distant shores like this one. To distant shores, America, the Irish diaspora is around the world, but mainly here in Australia at that time. That also led to the 1920 Irish War of Independence, the Great Rebellion, which was followed by a vicious civil war, which ended in the partition of Ireland, as you all know, and a century of armed conflict in Northern Ireland. It also brought forced immigration throughout the 18th and 19th century and extreme poverty on both sides of the Atlantic. So if your ancestry is Irish, this is your history too, on a cellular level. Frankly, actually, if your people are from any other former British colony, I would say much the same is true. My discovery of a century of family trauma didn't come as an exercise in idle curiosity. It was a necessity when my then 17-year-old son received a terrifying diagnosis. And this is the story that begins my memoir.
I'd been writing this memoir for several years when it struck me. If I was going to say something new or useful, I'd have to include my whole sad, messy family, going all the way back to Grandpa. I thought, no way, and put it in my attic. Well, it would have been my attic if I had one. At the time, I was a single mom living with Alex and Sammy in a tiny apartment in the valley. Alex was in that awful year between 14 and 15, with me slowly realizing there was something very wrong with him. I didn't yet get that there was plenty wrong with me, too. You feel like you can't breathe and you can't, talk normally or carry on. It's like, you're just at the edge of a cliff and your kid has fallen off and you can't grab him, it's too late. From the moment he was handed to me in the delivery room, Alex seemed not happy to be here. It wasn't until his brother Sammy arrived that I realized just how different Alex was compared to other children. Sammy loved to be stroked, hugged, and kissed, all the things Alex recoiled from. Years later, I was deeply affected when I read a study where mothers described the infancies of their children who went on to develop schizophrenia. It was as if he was in a world of his own, they all said. The exact way I'd so often thought of Alex. Only later did I realize how much untreated mental illness surrounded me growing up, with each generation producing its own tragic figure. In mine, it was my sister, Rita, who fell in love with heroin by the age of 16, destroying herself, much as my father and his father had done before her. I just knew it had to be stopped before another generation suffered the same fate. We have to realize that they need us to reclaim them. And so, but in order for me to reclaim my son, I had to reclaim my own feelings. And I had to have feelings which were very painful. It took 10 more years, but I finally found some answers. New science to explain repeating tragedies in families like mine. Some strategies to prevent disorders, even when a child is at high risk. I wrote this book for any parent who has spent sleepless nights worrying about a son or a daughter. This isn't a story about what might have been. It's about us stepping up as parents, fixing ourselves first, and building resilience into our families. From my experience, I can say that treatment works, recovery is possible, and prevention is within our reach.
But the story that I tell in A Lethal Inheritance, the subtitle is "A Mother Uncovers the Science Behind 3 Generations of Mental Illness." And it became important when you're given the terrifying diagnosis of one of your children of schizophrenia. One of the most important things they need to know is how much, if any, other mental illness occurred in previous generations. Because the more of it that there is or was, the larger your child's genetic load is, and so they're at much higher risk if there's evidence like that existing. However, as you all probably are aware, that before this generation, the one, even our children's generation, hardly any diagnosis or treatment even went on. And so what you had instead was a great deal of addiction, which is really self-medication for the most part, when those kinds of underlying conditions were there, and you had depression and, in my family's case, very likely suicides that were called premature accidents, early deaths, and this is entirely typical. All I'm saying here is that this story I tell starts with my son's, they call it lovely, psychotic break, which enabled an early intervention, the good news, and that ultimately stopping the progression of his schizophrenia, something which conventional psychiatry said was not possible, but mothers don't tend to take that sort of word as the final answer. And so the breakthrough that I refer to here was that following his diagnosis and the treatment, which dragged out for several years, I confronted my own undiagnosed major depression and began treatment for it, and again discovered the other generations behind me. So in the course of researching my memoir and just living these experiences, I came upon a relatively then new, because this was all happening, I should say, 1998 to 2000, early 2000s. I came upon a very new science, the science of epigenetics. Epigenetics confirms that your ancestors' trauma can manifest in you and reappear in your offspring as a specific physical illness or a mental illness. This science is really only about 25 years old. And some of it evolved from treatment of the descendants of Holocaust survivors, where certain patterns were discovered. And it also continued with others who had received, had had traumatic experiences, like the descendants of Japanese internment camp survivors. And it's any wide range of illnesses that have been correlated to what it's called an environmental insult. And if we drill down to a little bit of the science, I'm not going to do much of this, but just to share with you that the discovery, if you see over there, those are DNA strands. And epigenetics refers to the biochemical tags, caps they also call them, attached to DNA strands that control a gene's expression by delivering instructions to activate or suppress its functionality. These tags are the result of environmental insults. That's the way science chooses to categorize it, which can be famine, extreme stress, exposure to toxins, and these tags become stable and constitute a type of cellular memory passed to your offspring via the germline, which is what that little squiggly thing over there is. Here's an epigenetic case study that's very close to my family's story. 15 years after the Great Famine in Ireland, which was, again, 1845 to 1852-ish, admissions to Irish insane asylums, and that's what they called them then, increased by 87%. A high rate of schizophrenia in West Ireland's counties, where the famine was most severe, lasted through the 1970s. And from research done in Ireland and also in post-World War II Sweden, which had its own famine, famine doubles or triples the risk of schizophrenia developing in children and grandchildren. Now, the reason this became so relevant for me was when I was tracking down my family history, it led me to the discovery that my grandparents, Ellen Costello and her husband Michael, came from one of these hard-hit counties. Important because it raised the real possibility that my son's genetic load was quite robust. So we now move into some of the lessons I've promised you, and I'm going to be giving you 10 because we all like round numbers. So my first lesson, my suggestion is to look at yourself and identify your most dysfunctional trait. Mine was easy. I trust no one. I will put this in the context of the past tense, but I think that some of these things don't leave us easily. And so then the next question I would suggest is to ask yourself, what's the story you tell yourself about this trait? And in my case, as would be the case for most children or adult children who lost a parent at a young age, if I trust them, they'll abandon me. So having confronted my family history, I began the process of healing, and I think that part of the process of discovery and then beginning healing really has to deal with, it involves therapy usually, but one of the key questions to ask is, how do you carry this trauma? As mentioned, I opted for flight as my typical response, but you might identify more with one of the other 5 choices on the screen. And just to show you how common and how much this has entered the culture, these kinds of charts are freely available on the internet now. But to find out more, you have to arrive at the kind of position that this did not start with you. Whatever it is that you're looking at in yourself began earlier. And so what you can do at that point, and the real process involves going back at least 3 generations. And to do that, you have the help of all these websites now. and all these digitized census records and birth and death certificates. And one of the things to look for as you're doing this is for similar causes of death in different generations, because that's a real clue. In my case, I had the advantage of this kind of chart, which came directly from my son's medical file, where doctors put together the most likely family medical history based on basically the evidence and the hearsay and the death records and everything else that I just listed, which included multiple occurrences of depression, schizophrenia, possibly bipolar disorder, tons of substance abuse, at least one likely suicide, and several premature deaths, including my sister, who died at 38. And then I propose that you kind of allow yourself one of these what-if questions. What if you reframe your most dysfunctional trait as not necessarily your personal failing, but as evidence of an inherited trauma? The purpose of this is not to let yourself off the hook in any way, even if you could do that, but to understand the source of your wound in your ancestors' suffering and potentially enable healing, yours and theirs. As part of the reframing, it's important to go back again through your family history with a different set of questions. Who else might have been abandoned along the way? In order to find out, you have to break often a family code of silence and follow what I call the family shame vector. This is where you find the child mom gave up for adoption who was never spoken of, the sibling sent to an institution for a mysterious ailment or physical or mental, the grandparent whose suicide was called an accident, the problem child or the addicted adult around whom everyone tiptoes, the miscarried, stillborn, or aborted child, and of course the gay or lesbian cousin whose sexual identity is never acknowledged. Then at a certain point, it's important to take a step back and recognize cultural trauma. This is an amazing statistic that I can still hardly believe. In a 2022 survey, more than half of US citizens couldn't name all 4 of their grandparents. 25% didn't know where their ancestors had come from. I view this as the dark side of assimilation, ancestral erasure, which comes at a high cost. For me, I identified a kind of gut feeling that I really didn't belong anywhere. And I think it has to do with not feeling there are roots, because if you don't know, in my case, I did not know anything about my grandparents except maybe my Ellen's name. And I certainly didn't know what counties they came from. I did understand they were Irish, but that basically was it. And there are various reasons why we tend to erase these members of our, not even far family tree, but 1 generation or 2 generations back. And I have a suspicion that this feeling of rootlessness, that we don't really belong, has a lot to do with our uniquely American problem, or maybe not unique, but our American problem with new immigrants. I'll just leave that there. So by now you've amassed a lot of information, and it's time to get down to the business of healing, to deal with the effects of inherited trauma. It's important to take what's available from conventional medicine, but then to look beyond it. As mentioned earlier, I did not buy my son's doctor's prognosis for him. And I will say right now, he made a complete recovery. He doesn't even take medication. He's actually fine. He also did some substantial depth psychotherapy. And I'm managing my depression with medication and some spiritual practices I continue. But there's one particular tool I'd like to recommend, that if this is something that might be a path you want to go down, that it is one of the best therapeutic techniques, and that is family constellation therapy. Has anyone heard of it? Oh, great. Yeah, so it's a therapeutic process that incorporates elements of Gestalt, psychodrama, ancestor veneration, and shamanic journeying. The therapist, in a group of about anywhere from 5 to 10, guides group members to essentially reenact one participant's historical family trauma, essentially bringing that ancestor's experience into the present, having the participants embody different players. And in my personal experience, a session of family constellation therapy led to a profound healing for me and my children, my adult children, who were not present, but I saw changes in them anyway. So a key part of this ancestral healing and your healing is to honor your ancestors' strengths along with the suffering that you find that they experience, and which may in fact have led to your own trauma. For example, the Irish have an amazing fighting spirit, a creativity expressed in music, poetry, and storytelling, and their pre-Christian Druidic wisdom. And so my suggestion is that you take ownership of your ancestral strengths as your birthright. And with those strengths, as well as everything else you've learned, I believe that one of the ways to further heal is to tell yourself a new family story. I began with the same tragic facts I'd shared in my memoir, and then I gave myself permission to change the story by asking, what if? What if the protagonist of this story was not me, the science writer and frantic mother, but rather a neuroscientist from a family like mine, suddenly given responsibility for her voice-hearing teenage nephew? And what if some of her ancestors had possessed the gift of second sight? Finally, what if this woman and her nephew were to return to a corner of Ireland still steeped in pagan beliefs, where they encountered the sources of their ancestral trauma and a sect of neo-Druids who offered an avenue for healing based on the old ways? This new story became Orchid Child, a novel exploring the intersection of ancient Celtic mythology and 21st century neurodiversity. And here is another book trailer. Later, the book trailers are shorter. So you've noticed, no doubt, the presence of Druids. There's actually also a pair of woodland fairies present in this novel, as well as a parade of ghosts. And I submit that one way to get past our Western tendency to discount what we can't see or understand is to switch your storytelling to a folkloric register, which is kind of what I did here, mixing realism and magical realism it's probably the best way to put it. And what that allows you to do, and I do love that quote by whoever that person was, the Greek philosopher, myths are things that never happen but always are. Yeah. But with this kind of element in a story, you can create a negative space to reimagine characters and ancestors in particular. You can restore erased history. And you can represent inherited trauma using familiar story symbols like haunting, ghosts, demons, and curses. Because what could be a better way of saying ancestral trauma than curse? It really is one and the same, if you think about it. And you can depict healing by re-envisioning the past, honoring wounds, privileging strengths, and the survival of the lineage. Okay. Oh, this is going to float in. Yes, I remember now. So far my journey has taken me from life to fiction to now we come to prehistory. The story arc of a multi-generational healing I depict in Orchid Child began in my life by identifying and honoring my ancestral runes through family constellation therapy. I wonder if I have to hit this, Billy. Okay. Lo and behold, I found its key elements present in the 5,000-year-old practices of Druidism. All right. Here is some of what I discovered about these Celtic priests of old Ireland. I will now say we've come to the fun part of the evening. Who were the Druids? Organized Druidry flourished in Britain and those surrounding islands from 400 BC to 600 AD and continued surreptitiously in Ireland into the 17th century. For those who like classical Western historical sources, this page is for you. Generally believed to be Celtic in origin because Julius Caesar first encountered Druids among the Gaelic armies he fought in Gaul and Britain. He wrote in his Gaelic War, a book he wrote in 52 BC. It is said that in the schools of the Druids, students must learn many verses. They are not allowed to write down any sacred teachings, even though they record all manner of other civic business in Greek letters. In other words, they were not illiterate, as it turned out. The cardinal teaching of the Druids is that the soul does not perish at death, but passes from one body to another. In fact, there is a delay in Druidic thinking. They don't just pop from one body to another. There is a period of years in between. But Caesar concluded it was this teaching that made Gaelic warriors fearless in battle. They did not fear death. More Western classical history. A Greek historian wrote of the Druids, they are a highly respected class of prophets. Through auguries and animal sacrifices, they predict the future. They dispense justice, and they even step between warring parties and force hostile tribes to lay down their arms. And interestingly, Druidic laws later seeded Ireland's Brehon legal system. And one last one, which is my favorite. In the 6th century, First Synod of St. Patrick described the Druid as a priest, prophet, astrologer, and teacher. And this was not meant as praise. It is said that St. Patrick personally saw to the destruction of 125 Druidic manuscripts. Now, these were writings done by his early Christian monks who recorded Druidic teachings, and this is while coexistence was thought to be possible between these two very different belief systems. Druidism, for instance, does not do heaven and hell because he deemed them dangerous for the new religion.
So it's the snakes, huh?
Yeah, the snakes. With parallels to Greek, Pythagorean, and Egyptian mystery schools, Druidism encompassed an astronomically based mathematics an immortal soul, reincarnation, divination and prophecy, law, smithcraft, healing, and poetry. Earlier, proto-Druids, who lived 7,000 years ago, built hundreds of stone circles throughout the British Isles, later used for ceremonial purposes by their descendants. Like holy wells and the churches that later occupied these same locations, these stone circles were sited on ley lines derived from an ancient system of geomancy, tracing subtle currents of magnetic energy emanating from underground water and mineral veins. Archaeologists, it seems, have discovered not too long ago that significant patterns of ultrasound exist at stone circles, including Stonehenge, notably strongest during equinoxes and capable of creating silence in the circle. Just to give you an idea of the sophistication of the engineering involved. To Druids, all of nature is ensouled with Awen, a divine consciousness that is the source and sustainer of life. They understand trees as the most powerful holders of Awen, far exceeding humans. And in the Druidic thinking, Awen is the light that gives the mind the ability to reach beyond itself. Awen turns writers of verse into poets who perform stories and songs endowed with spells. Another way to say that is the power to awaken Awen in their listeners. Awen heals the sick, and it reveals what's hidden in the ground and in men's souls, offering glimpses of the future. And Awen, of course, connects the living with the dead. Druidic priests, who were, importantly, men and women, trained for 20 years to master the ability to tap Awen in two ways: invoking from a divine source outside themselves, and evoking from within themselves. The chalice, a staple of Celtic lore, was a sacred symbol of this practice of invoking and evoking. And now we get to the heart of the matter, the Druidic context for ancestral healing. Druids communicated with tribal ancestors who dwelled in an other world that was contiguous to their mundane reality. These ancestors preserved tribal history, genealogy, and the archetypes that shaped them as a people. Living Druids could travel to this ancestral otherworld to receive information on practical and spiritual matters for the tribe. Another way to say healing matters, in my view. These Druidic beliefs were coded and passed down in Irish mythology, poetry, and song, still read and performed today. And now is where I make a leap. Druidism meets quantum science. And I'll do this with the help, I'll make this turn with the help of, on your left side of the screen, the legendary poem of the Druid Taliesin, who begins, Awen Aganath, I sing inspiration, I bring it forth from the depths, the connected river that flows. I know its might, I know how it ebbs, I know how it flows. Changing vocabularies and language. Let's start with Werner Heisenberg, Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist. Underlying all matter is an invisible and unseen realm from which an intelligent observer manifests reality. Consciousness, this is John Van Neumann, who was on the Manhattan Project. Consciousness doesn't just affect reality, it creates reality. Just let those sit there for a minute as contrasting ways of saying what I think are a lot of the same things. Rejecting, so what did the quantum physicists do for us? Rejecting a materialist view of reality, quantum physics gave us particle-wave duality, the universe as waves of possibility with mathematically predictable events caused by acts of conscious observation. And my favorite, quantum entanglements. Once two particles interact, they communicate instantly and across vast distances. This is Einstein's spooky actions at a distance. And now, something I wasn't aware of until I dove in here, there's such a thing as quantum biology, which has transferred the concept of quantum entanglement to biological system. So a few steps closer to us. By identifying quantum effects in living organisms, for instance, redefining photosynthesis as a coordinated resonance of chlorophyll molecules with liquid crystals creating a holographic bridge between non-local reality and the biochemical event. That was a direct lift. I cannot totally explain that to you, but take it for what it is. I like this quote from Mei Wan Ho, who is a quantum biologist and a geneticist. The challenge for us all is to rethink information processing, not in a biochemical mechanistic framework, but in the context of the quantumly organic whole. So to me, this begs the question, what is the nature of our connection to ancestors who share our DNA, history, and trauma? Let's look at Einstein. A human being is part of a whole. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. David Bohm, who I'm sure many of you have read, the physical universe is interpenetrated by a non-local realm, not bound by time and space. Of course, he gave it a name, the implicate order, which he defined as a kind of multidimensional pre-space, with parallels to Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic fields. So if consciousness creates reality, can conscious intention put us in a state of resonance with our ancestors to heal shared wounds? What if spiritual practices such as those employed by the Druids, past and present, and by indigenous peoples on every continent, that is, meditation, shamanic trance journeying, chanting, and group rituals, can facilitate such healing? And what if ordinary people can employ similar techniques to access their ancestors for the purpose of healing themselves and their offspring? I'm going to play for you now, if we can manage it, a piece of the audiobook of my novel, Orchid Child, in which...
It's not in the vein.
Could you hold on a minute? Okay. So in this scene, the teenage boy who has second sight and who is in Ireland with his aunt and mixing up with Druids, is here in this scene in a space, in an otherworldly space. I won't tell you how he got there, because that would be effectively a spoiler. But in this space, he encounters his great-grandfather. And in this scene, I have tried to kind of synthesize a lot of what I've been talking about here and what excited me about the connections between ancestral healing and Druid type of indigenous belief systems. So this is a 12-minute segment of the book towards the end of the book.
I just read this morning. I know which one you're talking
Oh,
about.
good.
Yeah.
All right, it's all yours, Phil.
Anymore. He's leaving his body behind. Everything feels lighter up here. Wait, where is here? No familiar landmarks. Not day or night. Some hazy in-between. Clouds of color flitting around, some close enough to touch, if he had a hand. Everything is calm here. Him, too. He moves along like no problem. No bumps or hurry. Like he's the driver of this person named Teague, not a passenger riding in the back seat. Wait. If he's not in Teague's body, can he still be the driver? Of course you can, dear. You're the same soul no matter what vehicle you travel in. The old lady with the tiara. At least, it's her face, the same voice. She has no body, just a wisp of light around her face. What's your name? He asks. I was last called Anne. Suffice it to say we're kin. You're the spitting image of me, Michael. She smiles. Didn't I tell you I'd be back? Yeah, but you didn't say I'd have to die first. Not that I mind. I like it here. Don't get too comfortable, son. You may just be passing through. That decision hasn't been made yet. Oh, yeah? Who's going to make it? Oh, it'll be you. With a little help from a certain person who can help you fix what ails you. None of this is said out loud. That's not how it works here. Here he is now, Teague. Good evening, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you, Mrs. Callahan. I can take it from here. Just like that, Anne disappears, and a new guy, bald, with a belly like a kickball, wearing a long apron shows up. He smells like the stuff Maureen uses to polish furniture. You can call me Paddy. Come along, lad. We have to talk. Quicker than he could say, all right, they're in a place that looks familiar. He's seen those shelves and bottles before. The scale, too, except it's not rusty. He's the one who was in the photo with Gran. You're Patty from the drugstore. Aye, I am. Please take a seat. We have a decision to make. Teague spins on the stool and watches the jars fly by like he's on a carousel. The smells of apples and spearmint and pine needles, oranges and cinnamon and... I'm here to help clear obstacles out of your way. He grabs a hold of the counter. What obstacles? I think you know. You mean my voices? He nods. You've been the target of unsavory messengers. Yeah, Larry's a total drag. True, but it's not just the outsiders you have to watch out for. Already, at your tender age, you've loved and lost people dear to you. Megan was a beautiful but fragile soul. Your gran, me darling Ellen, recognized your gift. She shared her excitement with me when she arrived. Gran is here? She was, but has since returned. Don't worry, you two will meet again. That I can promise you. Teague has his doubts about a promise made by a dead person in heaven, but it's a nice thought. Because of your losses, you've armored your heart and come close to snuffing out your light. I know about my armor, but you also have the power to dispense with it. What makes you think I can do that? Because of your nature, and because you've come to this place at this time. Listening to Patty talk makes Teague feel more alive than ever, which is pretty strange, since he's probably dead as a doorknob. Patty looks to each side, then back at him. I'm sure you've seen the displays in museums. I think the word I'm looking for is diorama. You mean the scenes of cavemen and extinct animals? Exactly. I want you to picture each of your ancestors' lives as a single moment captured in a diorama. For simplicity's sake, let's call them boxes. My grandmother's hunger lives inside my father's box. My father's stolen language echoes in my box. The blood I spilled on Main Street lines my daughter's box. On and on it goes. Woozy Teague puts his head in his hands. Don't despair, lad. There's more to our lineage than sorrow. Deeper in the past, we were powerful warriors, poets, diviners. You mean wizards. They had different talents, but each used their power to help their people live well on this land. The battle between the dark and light forces goes on inside and outside each of us. Take Liam. He's lost his way. But I think you would agree there's still good in that young man. He was my friend before tonight. And he could be again. Teague, you're fortunate to have a circle of love around you right now. The one you call Finn could be an important helper to you. He was a total shit to Kate tonight. Yes, he was. But there's a reason why you've all become entangled again. Remember, light is stronger than darkness. How do you know that? Because light is life. Wouldn't you rather be on the side of creation? Well, when you put it that way, when you create a new chapter in the story of your people, you not only heal yourself, you help those who came before you and the ones who follow. You all suffer from the same wound, which festers as each generation fails to take it on. How can something I say or do right help all these dead people from 100 years ago? Patty twists his mouth like a pretzel. Good question. Let's say you choose to re-enter your body on this day with the intention of telling the story only you can tell. You can be sure that one of your ancestors is seeing and feeling your healing in his own time as a powerful premonition. No shit? In a weird way, Patty makes sense. Until Teague follows his thoughts a few steps further and gets waylaid again. But what good does it do him? I mean, he's back there, and I'm here. Imagine this ancestor and his family are suffering through the great hunger. Or the poor fella is facing a firing squad. Only one thing can help a man's soul. Whatever his fortune might be, and that's hope. If not for his own lot in life, then for his children or grandchildren. Hope is one of the threads connecting you and your ancestors through time. You can't see it, but it's there, occupying every cell of your body. You mean like it's in my DNA? Patty smiles like he's got a secret. That's one word for it. Teague is having a hard time processing Patty's words. There are too many for his brain to put in the right order. He closes his eyes, and they transform into bits of light that move around until they form a trunk line with symmetrical lines branching out to become a snowflake. When it's complete, a new thought crystallizes. The things that happen to us don't arrive with meanings. We give them meaning when we put them together in a story. The problem is Teague's not sure he's up to the job. He opens his eyes and finds Patty with his chin down, looking up at him over the top of his glasses. Sometimes I just want to hide, he confesses. Patty puts one hand on each of Teague's shoulders. Your modern medicines and healers can help you if you let them, until you're stronger. You mean I shouldn't ditch my meds? They're for your protection. You'll know if and when the time comes to go without. Now, you must decide what you're going to do. Is this my last chance? For this lifetime, yes. There will be other opportunities, but you've come such a long way as Teague. Maybe you ought to give him this victory. Yeah, he kind of deserves it. Can I ask you something? Ask away. Did I have to get shot to know all this? He laughs. Let's just say you signed up for certain things. Your soul badly wants this lesson. Patty's smile fills his round face. It's the last thing Teague sees before he finds himself on the ceiling of a room filled with bright light that make him squint. There's his body again, on a table. He looks like crap. Skin as white as the floor tiles, blue lips, maybe dead. But then why are there still 5 people working on him? Machines beeping and flashing numbers. An IV pole is attached to his arm, a tube down his throat. BP down to 50. Body temp is 60 and dropping. A woman reads off one machine. H6 is below 70 GL. A guy with gray sideburns has a scalpel in his hand. Get me blood, he shouts to nobody in particular. He's type O, says the woman holding a clipboard. Go, the surgeon tells her, and she hightails it out the double doors. The hole in his midsection is the size of a quarter, and there's still blood oozing out. Black, not red. I'm going for a midline. Yikes! He's cutting a vertical line down his stomach. Strange, Teague doesn't feel a thing. Now the guy puts his finger in there, like he's fishing around for something. Maybe the bullet. Holy shit. This looks like it'll take a while. He's seen enough. Where's Kate? He needs to find her.
There you go.
Awesome.
He's not in the van.
Oh, we don't. Okay. This is just the last two slides here. Lesson number 10. Tap your intuition and reach out to your ancestors. This is a particularly good book for getting into the process. It's by Daniel Four. He's a psychotherapist, and he has several steps, that some of which we've kind of echoed here, to set the intention, to heal the trauma, to connect with one particular ancestor in one lineage, because of course we all have two, and maybe some more within it. And suggests rituals, and also he suggests that you find a way to share your experience by telling the story with at least your own family members. Decide whether to go on from there. So, we have come to the end for this, and I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you have.
Could you just show that last slide?
Oh, sure, I
one
can
time,
leave it
a
up.
little longer?
Yeah, this one, yeah. I think this book might be here. Is that true, Billy? Yeah, so they have, and it's in the public library too.
You speak of, you know, for us, you said it would be a good idea for us to think of an ancestor during this process.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you also spoke of they come to you then. So could you tell us about that in your experience?
Yeah.
Does Ellen come to you, or?
Yeah, pretty much daily. And she started coming to me when I started writing the memoir, because I was just discovering about her life then. As I said, I didn't even know her name when I was faced with the question from my son's treating psychiatrist. All right, let's go back 3 generations and list the causes of death. And I drew I had no idea. And I think that's pretty typical. So after finding out a few details, through these various public records, I sought her out. And this was helped when I went to Ireland, when I did a Thin Places tour of West Ireland, which was a tour of stone circles and places where the veil between this world and the next is thinner. And certainly stone circles qualify. And much to my surprise, I heard, not out loud, but the way in which Teague described how he heard things in this other world. I heard from not only Ellen, but then also my great-grandmother, whose name was Bridget O'Rourke. And I got really pretty directional messages. As I said, they're plain spoken, they don't mess around. I was afraid at that time that it wasn't my story to tell because I was American. And basically the response I got was nonsense. Get over it. This is your job right now. To tell the story of our tribe and help other people find what they need to know about the generations that came before them for the benefit of those today and tomorrow, and in this kind of peculiar way of thinking, which hopefully you might now be open to, even healing the past from the present, because it's all connected. And, if not in the two-dimensional reality, certainly in the multi-dimensional reality, there is a good chance that all kinds of things are going on that we don't understand or see or have a way to measure. And that's, of course, where the quantum physics thing comes in. But I getting back to your question, I make a practice. I have an ancestral altar. It's one of the things that Daniel 4 suggests. And I sit there most mornings and talk to Ellen at least. And, there's been a number of interesting coincidences and serendipities that have come about. I credit her with many of those. So I think that if you have a feeling about a particular ancestor with whom you feel a spark of recognition, either through a photo or just from the stories you've heard, and you conjure their image, I think you open up a conversation. They're willing to help. They want to help. And the more that you invite them, if you don't invite them, no one will show up. That because you are tied to them, you can say by blood, or we don't really know by what. But we know, certainly on the biological level, we know about the epigenetic part of the story, that there are physical changes that happen that get transferred from one generation to the next on the germline. It kind of can't get much more concrete than that, which we didn't have any of that evidence until these recent, research breakthroughs. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, not saying it's me, it's totally me, but okay, so let's say your ancestor, and in my case my grandmother, whom I lived with for most of my childhood, we had a very tumultuous relationship, and I know that she had trauma from before my mother was born and after my mother was born. How do you explore that? Do you really want to invite that person that you're still trying to process through and get past? How do you handle that?
Well, you
if
have
that
to be
family member is connected to you in a way that doesn't feel safe.
Right. Well, then you don't go to that person, and but maybe you go. You go back a little further, and you find out as much as you can by way of the records that might exist of what actually happened to her and her mother, and before that, where did they emigrate from? Were they Americans?
My grandmother was, but her grandmother on one side and my mother's father on the other side were from Ireland.
Uh-huh. Do you know when they came over?
Probably not off the top of my head, but I do.
Yeah.
I have done some research.
Yeah, you will find that out, and then you'll know whether it was immediately post-famine or during the famine.
Yeah.
When that's a lot of people came then, or in that big rush after the turn of the 20th century when my people came. And so I would say, no, don't go right away to the person with whom you had this kind of tumultuous relationship. But there would be others who would have insights into what actually happened, and happened in the generation just previous to hers, because of course it's all cyclical, and so yeah, good luck with that. Anyone? Yeah.
I was thinking about in my family, the side where the genealogical research has really been done the most is my father's side, who were actually English immigrants to New England. Came right after the Pilgrims, and because a lot of research was done 50, 60 years ago, I know some of those stories, and there's some severe traumas in there too. And it's interesting if you think that some of these traumas have left residuals in us. Like, it might be good to look at some of the other ones besides. I've kind of had this narrow focus in one direction, but you know.
Yeah, well, since they mix up in you, right? So there's this strange stew of both sides,
Yeah.
you know, mucking around in us. Yeah. Sometimes I think the Irish, because they're, you know, louder and more dramatic, we see and hear and feel their traumas a little easier than perhaps the British.
And more recent. And,
Yeah, and the more, yes, the further back, yeah. But it would be a repeating kind of trauma too. So it would be very interesting if you know what happened at some point to see how it might have
that's a good
manifested, you know, depending on what sort of trauma were you thinking of from way back?
Well, one was a couple of ancestors in the late 1600s. The Indians in Connecticut finally realized that this was a really big problem.
Yeah.
And at first they traded with
Yeah.
colonists, but then later they realized we're going to lose a lot here. We're going to lose everything. So there was something called King Philip's War, and a teenage ancestor of mine and his young wife were trying to make it back and forth, but were caught by King Philip, by the tribe, and killed.
Oh.
And so I know that's in there. That's in the mix.
Wow.
In that whole story. And I don't know that I'd find other examples of that.
Yes,
going
right.
on,
Indian
but-
wars.
But
Yeah.
shoot, those wars happened all across
Yeah.
the U.S. and in many places, and they were, the traumas on all sides, especially more so on the Native Americans who
Right.
didn't just lose a few people like colonists did. So,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's interesting. Or I think of one like a great grandfather who gave his son the farm, and then he liked to gamble, and he lost that farm that he'd given his son.
Yeah.
He had to pull the farm back, and the son
Yeah.
didn't have a farm, didn't have a way to make a living. And I was wondering, that could go back a few other
Yes.
instances like that
Yeah.
could go back, and that might be traceable.
It's an addiction for certain.
Some kind of a,
Yeah.
that's true, it's an addiction.
Yeah, I mean, every generation and every person suffers, right? So what we're looking for is patterns, and the kind that can be, I mean, to use the word healed, are ones that have to do with people who I think have been erased and not acknowledged, so their suffering has not been honored. And I think where you see the opportunity to put people back where they belong, to restore their place in the family tree, is a concrete step that you can take that seems to have healing effects. That's what my experience of the family constellation therapy is, that it's not like you can fix anything that happened back then, but if you can restore the person who was considered not worthy of being acknowledged for all those reasons that we've had to not acknowledge people, they were either bad or whatever, that is a healing step that seems to have a rippling effect. And certainly within the room that this therapy was going on, judging by the amount of tears shed and my feelings of release, for instance, in that session, it seemed to come about that my Ellen's husband, who died on their honeymoon in a drowning accident, wasn't aware that that Ellen was pregnant with my father, and that he, in the course of this session, where certain people were enacting both, all in me, each of them, my grandparents, even my two sons, and my father, who was orphaned at 5, to have these characters, real people, face each other and have Michael say to his son, I didn't know your mother was pregnant when I died. And who knows? I mean, she was probably 3 months pregnant. Very good chance he didn't know. But the fact that this thought came to this person, just my fellow therapy participant, to say, there was no one in the room who didn't believe that was what Michael felt, and that that was a representation in the present of what happened back then. And so there was a kind of healing between father and son. That would be my father, and me hearing it, my sons watching, that there were these people put back in their rightful places. So the losses that come in, as again, every generation, every family, the pattern of loss that I experienced, losing my father at 8, my father lost his mother at 5, Ellen died in the 1919 flu epidemic. So it's these losses are going to keep happening, of course, it's life and death, but to kind of put the pieces, the unknown parts back in the story has a profoundly healing effect. Because, often kids think it's their fault, their parents died. I mean, we have these strange things we come to that we think as children, and because the general tone of that generation, at least, we can hope it has improved, is just not to talk about it. That, we don't know that children had these feelings, that it was their fault. So it's all about, finding the truth that's been hiding and that has caused a lot of damage. That's kind of how I look at it. And that's not just me. I think that it's been shown that this therapy and this kind of ancestral healing work lifts a lot of pain and unnecessary suffering, certainly from the present, and we can only speculate about the past. But we also can see that if we deal with it, we're not going to pass it on to the next generation. My son recovered. My sister did not. And it's kind of that simple. Yeah.
So very high on my to-do list is delving into the Druidic part of my ancestry, and given the secrecy and the nature of Druidism, and like you pointed out, how a lot of texts about it were destroyed, do you have any reputable avenues that you could recommend
I do.
to doing that research?
Yeah, all kinds of Irish scholarship has been done, and Welsh and British. And there are, I call them neo-Druidic, there are major associations of Druids in current day in Britain and in Ireland. I knew the chief Druid who lives in the county of Roscommon, and he conducts ceremonies. He was the model for the character of Finn in my novel. And that he is the most prominent Druid in Ireland now. And, so the fact that we don't have direct, endowment of texts from, like the Bible, we are to believe, that it doesn't mean that those oral histories were not passed down, because they were. And the other thing that you then have to kind of open your mind to, which is kind of a challenge, is that they're coded in lots of folklore and mythology and poetry. And so that once you start learning the codes of, like, say, who knew what a chalice meant? I thought it was just a chalice, that happened to show up a lot in these, Celtic stories. Well, no, it means a particular form of practice that is actually at the heart of how they do the magic that they do, and literally the magic that they do. The interdimensional changes they can pull off, even something as simple as finding water with a stick. We can know the type of stick they use, what kind of hickory or oak branch they use. I think it's hickory. But if you and I pick up this stick, we're not going to find anything. So there's training involved. And, so all of it is kind of coded and passed on. I mean, there are still people walking, what do they have a name? What do they call these people? The diviners of, the dowsers, yeah. And so, that's the kind of, that is ancient lore that exists today and is just kind of like, I love how it's sort of like accepted. Yes, there are these people who can find water, but let's not bother ourselves with how that happens exactly. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how this relates to, like, the ACEs study? Did those 17,000 people have all those adverse childhood experiences because of, higher, more concentrated generational trauma? I mean, I'm just thinking that explained it on an individual level.
I mean, there's slavery, for instance, that affects a lot of people who are carrying trauma and suffering because, it's as if we're going backwards and deciding not to speak about things that were so obviously major cultural, broad-scale trauma. So I think that I understand in a lot of African-American cultural circles and therapy-related kind of projects that there is a lot of attention given to trying to trace the ancestral trauma within the descendants of slaves and to really break down how it's playing out for different individual families. That's some really exciting therapeutic work. There's a woman who's in charge of, might be family therapy, or she has a prominent position in the California State Department of Health, a black woman scholar who's kind of really done some far-reaching work. I'll get you her name if you give me yours, because she's done some really interesting things about, tying it all together for young black children. Yeah, I think, the fact that it didn't start with you, one of those books, and The Body Keeps Score. They've been at the top of the bestseller lists for several years now. This is percolating into the culture in a very positive way, I think. And so I think that there's a reason why this book is very popular, because you can sort of start and try working at home for yourself. And then, I think the thing that people find quickly is that the group experience, the group therapy or the group ritual experience is where the most healing can happen, which is interesting considering the Druids understood that, quite a while ago, as do most indigenous peoples who do these kinds of ceremonies. It's not, I happen to have dived into Druids, but every culture, certainly Latin America, is loaded with shamans who are leading this kind of healing work. So anybody else want to say anything? Or I just so you know, this will be on YouTube, and that I have some books here if anybody wants Orchid Child. It is also available. We heard my wonderful narrator who managed like 15 different Irish accents, which is why I didn't read it, because I had her. That audiobook is available on Audible or anywhere else that you get your audiobooks if you prefer that way. And the ebook is only available for the time being on Amazon, Kindle, but the paperback is everywhere. You can get it. And my memoir, if you should be interested in it, I have a couple copies here, but it's also available. You can order it anywhere in ebook and paperback. And anybody who wants a copy of this PowerPoint, I'm happy to share it with you. So the thing is, I have a piece of paper there that you can put your name and email down, and then if you just add a note, please send PowerPoint. I'll be happy to do that.
I noticed that when you were talking about connecting with a single ancestor, it just happened to be that it was your own gender. Is that something that you found Is that meaningful, or is it
Yeah.
just something that?
Well, yeah, I think for me, I mean, I think it probably is. I don't know. I haven't asked around enough, but I did hear from a male ancestor over in one of those stone circles I was sitting at. I was kind of, he made it clear, he was John is my great grandfather, and he made it clear that he was speaking for the men, but that I was doing just fine with the women. And that should just kind of continue, but that he was just putting in his 2 cents about, just get on with it. And, yeah.
There's an author you probably know about called Martin Prechtel, and he's out of the Taos. He's a German Native American, and he feels that every person in this country needs to return to their indigenous roots. And I feel that's what you've done. This is all indigenous, and it's all totally familiar. And each, as far as I can tell, each indigenous culture had its own level of consciousness, that some of them were very evolved and some of them were very basic. And it seems to me that the Druid is very evolved, much like the Taoists or the Asians religions. And almost every quality that you described as a Druid, I have.
Is your ancestry?
And I never realized this was ancestral. So this is very interesting. Thank you. Yeah,
and I think if you're of another indigenous ancestry, it would behoove you to work through that one. And, it's just that as Irish Americans and any kind, Welsh or Scottish or, in Britain, because of course early Britain was all about Druids, and there are many Druid organizations now there. And, there is Stonehenge after all. Yes. So
it's kind of interesting to have you bring up that point, and then in your slideshow you talk about the scientific proof now in the genetic strands with those tags about that carryover. So it seems, if you have a certain mindset of reincarnation and rebirth of the soul, that soul doesn't always go back into the same, of course, ancestral line. That soul can go and re-inhabit any body in any culture. So then you have a compounding factor of those genetic tags in the ancestral line, plus the genetic or the soul trauma of all past lives coming together. It's a can of worms as far as past healing that can be done.
Well, in fact, the Druids felt, and I'm not sure about other cultures, but they felt that your tendency would be to return in the body in your tribe. And I think I heard from Billy, right, that that's true in some of the Tibetan and other Buddhists. Yeah, that you don't roam that far. There tends to be enough unfinished business to keep you busy in your tribe. So that's interesting. Yeah.
So I have a question about the constellation therapy, because I haven't heard of that before. It sounds really fascinating. You said that your son wasn't present for that, but they still got, your children still got the reaped the benefits.
Yes.
So in that session, in that group session, were there other family members, or was it other people to help kind of facilitate the reenactment of those traumas?
The latter, and no other family members of mine were present. But mine wasn't the only story we enacted in the course of the weekend. Everyone had a session, which tended to last like 2 or 3 hours each one. So I was a player in other people's stories. And then when it's your story being enacted, you actually sit outside and watch it all, which is incredibly powerful. So you have the experience of when you're asked to play her mother at age 16, if that's I remember I was that for someone who was a given away baby whose mother she never found, and so I was playing her mother, and it was incredibly emotional to play that person, but it wasn't like I had to make it up. It really felt like it was coming to me by way of the fact that we had assembled this intention as a group, and it was like 9 or 10 people and a very skilled therapist. So if you do consider doing this, put your name on my list and I'll send you the contact. There's a institute in San Francisco that trains a lot of these therapists, and I would not take a chance on someone who's dabbling in it, because it's a very delicate process. Lots of strong emotions come out. So I would make sure that the therapist who says they do family constellation therapy has some kind of credential.
There are some very skilled people though.
Around here? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can think of a couple right away.
Oh, okay, great. So
Yeah.
you might ask Nikki for those names. Okay, well, I think we've kind of come to our end of the time. It's been really fun talking to you all. This is a new presentation for me, so it's really been great to get a chance to run it out before you.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.